Welcome back. This is your 10-minute charge up. I'm Scott McKnight. Let's get into it. So what's the story? Last week, U.S. immigration authorities launched a large-scale raid at an EV battery factory under construction just outside of Savannah, Georgia. They detained some 475 people in the process, almost all of whom were South Korean nationals. Now, this just wasn't any plant. For one, the mega facility was a joint venture between two Korean giants, the automaker Hyundai and battery powerhouse LG Energy Solutions. The facility itself was also one that the Trump administration hailed as proof of the effectiveness of tariffs and this more aggressive trade policy and this bigger project to build up America's industrial capacity again. And then there was this strange end zone dance by U.S. immigration authorities posting this high quality video of the raid to their official Twitter account. The raid was actually the largest carried out by U.S. law enforcement since Homeland Security was created about 24 years ago. And maybe it's the most impacting because of the nature of the industry they targeted in this case. Now, adding to all of this, there is that big long-term question about the direction of U.S. industry and industrial policy in particular. The tariffs are supposed to be to stimulate domestic manufacturing, to reverse U.S. trade deficits, and to revive America's industrial strength. But with a raid like this on an industry like battery making and EVs, and the Trump administration's bigger war on green energy, which actual industries is America trying to lead in? I'm Scott McKnight. This is your 10-minute charge up. Let's get into it. Let's start with the inciting event. U.S. Immigration Services and a convoy of trucks and vans and cameras rolled up on this meta plant, the joint venture facility run by Hyundai and LG, about a half hour from Savannah, Georgia. And their reason? Well, a bunch of alleged illegal employment practices. But what makes this raid unique is the size, for sure. The Georgia manufacturing complex is on land about the size of 2,200 football fields and will cost almost $8 billion to construct when all is said and done. But then also this mega facility is one that the Trump administration and Hyundai, the South Korean automaker, earlier hailed as crucial to turning America into an electrical vehicle powerhouse. America is already a big market for EVs, and EV plants are popping up all across the country, though some of this may be in doubt with the Trump administration's recent cuts to subsidies and tax credits for EVs. More on this in a different episode. Now, back to the Hyundai LG plant. Speaking of scale, the raid detained 475 people, almost all of whom were South Korean nationals, which made it the largest single-site enforcement operation in the 23-year history of Homeland Security. U.S. immigration authorities claim that those workers were doing a mix of bad things, that they crossed the border illegally, that they worked on non-working visas, that they overstayed their visas. That's the official claim anyways. Despite some complaints from locals and local labor unions, more on that in a bit, it turns out that many of the South Korean nationals were actually on visas like the B1, where they could serve as temporary instructors. In other words, teaching U.S. workers how to make the advanced components that go into batteries. Now, onto the fallout. The raid, worsened by the videos that ran through mainstream and social media, has led to a sharp and swift fallout back in South Korea. In fact, South Korea's president has had to intervene, calling for U.S. authorities to treat South Koreans with respect while they're in the U.S. Meanwhile, major South Korean companies, several like Samsung, SK On, and LG Energy, that have huge investments and even some operations already up and running in the U.S., well, those companies have ordered stop to non-essential travel for their workers in the U.S. Now, those detained were released and flown back to South Korea. Not deported per se, that would have long-term visa implications, but voluntarily leaving. Now, who knows if they'll ever come back to the U.S. or if they'll ever want to. So it's led to a flare-up between the U.S. and South Korea, a long-standing ally, and a country that has largely played along with Trump's administration's hard-edged tariff and trade negotiations. So on the foreign policy front, the U.S. again finds itself aggravating allies, whether through tariffs, most recently irritating India and Brazil, or through veiled threats of annexation for Greenland and calling Canada the 51st state, or just straight up making stuff up, like investment numbers from Japan, the European Union, and Qatar. Now, the raid and fallout may also put bigger investments from Hyundai and LG in the US in jeopardy. Earlier this year in March, Hyundai announced a whopping $21 billion in investments in the United States alone. Now, that included a vehicle plant, a steel factory, and the battery plant, among other things. These investments are also a major reason why the state of Georgia, never really an auto powerhouse, has become the largest source of announced automaking investment in recent years. Republican Governor Brian Kemp called the project a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and these investments as the basis for fruitful partnerships for decades to come. What prompted the raid? There's been some local anger at the presence of the South Korean companies, especially among unionized tradespeople who have claimed South Koreans weren't just doing the advanced battery making and training that they've claimed, but also working as welders and plumbers and pipe fitters and HVAC technicians. In other words, jobs that locals likely could have done if given the chance. Now, Trump has gone both ways on the issues, first saying that the workers detained were illegal aliens and ICE was just doing its job. Then later, in a Truth Social post, called for foreign companies to legally bring your very smart people with great technical talent to build world-class products in the US. Now, these two things aren't necessarily exclusive, but they may be a tight window for foreign companies who are thinking or maybe reconsidering their investments in the US. On that note, the US has been the site of a flurry of investments in recent years for battery making and EVs, but also for semiconductor making and design, solar, and so on. Those investments largely came about due to subsidies passed by the Democrats under the Biden administration under that bizarrely named Inflation Reduction Act. That 10-year monster tax credit plan was designed to get the US into the leading ranks of green energy of all kinds. Now, this bill, of course, is one that the Trump administration has been attacking for quite some time, and as part of its attack, well, it's ended that tax credit of $7,500 for buyers of new EVs in the US. Let's do that one in a different episode. Now, back to battery making. The US doesn't have a company with even a single percent of global market share here. That's exclusively the realm of companies in East Asia, including LG Energy Solutions, the company whose site in Georgia was just raided. In other words, the US is quite new to producing batteries and needs not just capital on a gargantuan scale, but also the knowledge of how to make them. So these Asian battery making companies typically bring engineers and technicians from their home country to set up new factories because these aren't your run-of-the-mill factories. They're incredibly expensive. They have very high-tech machinery, including robots that coat, that slice, that assemble the components that help power a car. And of course, all of this is done under extremely rigorous construction protocols. There is very, very little room for error. That's the secret sauce of battery making itself, which much of the battery cell technology is proprietary and held extremely close to the chest by the companies that know how to do it. Now, that makes it quite difficult to be a partner in one of these joint ventures, but if you need the technology, they have it. All of this brings us back to questions of foreign investment in industries and where the US has little experience or expertise, and of course, this bigger industrial competitiveness question. America has been bleeding manufacturing jobs since the early 1980s. Some of that is about efficiency and automation and basically companies being able to produce more with less workers. Sure, but it's also been about foreign competitors like China and yes, South Korea, strategically using their own industrial policies to gain bigger parts of global manufacturing. Now, remember, the industrial competitiveness stuff is supposed to be why the tariffs are in there in the first place, to reverse deficits with manufacturing powerhouses like China, like South Korea, but also to revive US manufacturing through their expertise and investments. This also raises deeper questions about what actually is the long-term plan here? And of course, what are the long-term effects of these tariffs? If the Trump administration isn't serious about batteries or EVs or any other form of clean energy. And of course, it also deters foreign investments through these random large-scale raids of facilities like the one in Georgia. What is this industrial renaissance actually supposed to include? This is your 10-minute charge up. I'm Scott McKnight. See you next time.